Welcome to another video. So in this video we're going to be replacing the front brake pads and rotors. This is actually a Dodge Cummins 3500, but your 2500s and your 3500s are exactly the same. The only difference is they actually have an adapter for the dual wheels. So I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. What I want to do is cover why you could be looking at this and you're saying, why is he putting drilled slotted rotors on a truck? It's not a race truck. Well, if you look at this truck, it's got a tool body on the back. Okay, and this truck weighs a little over 9,000 pounds all the time. When I had the regular rotors on here, they wouldn't even last the whole brake pad and they would start to warp, and I could feel it start getting vibration when I stopped. Now I do a lot of city driving. I live outside Washington DC, and this is most of my work is in Washington DC, so it's stop and go, stop and go, stop and go. So the rotors are actually heat sinks. So if you look at the side, you see all of them have the slots. Well, when you put the brakes on, it causes friction. That's what makes you stop, and it gets hot. So the slots in the drill holes actually let more air go through, circulate it, and help keep it a little bit cooler. So if you look at this one is shot. You can see it's cracked and it's blued. That's heat. Now that's probably, I think that's 4 sets of brake shoes. Whereas the solid rotors, I couldn't even make it 1 set. The reason I know this truck is just shy of 600,000 miles, so I've put quite a few brakes on here. And when I kept burning up the rotors every time, I said, well, let me try it. So I tried it one time, and I'll tell you, I've never gone back. But that's completely up to you what you want to do. So at any rate, let's get to it and move on. The first thing we got to do is, if you have a dual rear wheel 3500, you're going to have to remove this spacer. So we're going to have to take that off. And what I generally do is stick a pipe in here like this to wedge it, and then take all the nuts loose. So you have nuts all the way around. So we're going to take those loose, and then we'll move on to what's next. Okay, so the adapter's off. And I should have said in the beginning, always make sure you use jack stands on things. Falls on people and they die. It happens all the time. It's not worth the price of a brake job. So at any rate, if you don't have dualies, you're already here. So what I generally do is turn the wheel so the brakes are out some. It makes it a little bit easier. And then if you look in the back here, right here, there's little rubber pieces. There's an Allen screw. So we need to take, there's one top and there's one bottom. We need to take those out. But first what I do is I take a pry bar of sorts. So I take a pry bar and I pry out on the brakes to get them loose off of the rotor, because when they're tight, if you turn it, you should be pretty tight on the rotor. It doesn't want to come off because it catches on everything. So I pry the brakes off a little bit and then take those 2 Allen screws out, and then we should be able to take this out. So we're going to do that next, and then we'll move on. So once you get those 2 bolts out, your rotor will just slide straight out. Now, like I say, it's got to be loose. If you can't get it off, it's too tight, just stick your bar back in there and pry out on those shoes a little bit. And these shoes just sit in there. You can just pull them out. So we'll pull them out, and then we got to take this bracket off that holds your brake caliper. And that's got 2 bolts, one up top and one down lower. And we take those 2 bolts out next, and this whole bracket will come off. So we're going to do that, and what I generally do is I just set the caliper on top there. You don't want to leave it hanging by the rubber hose too much. So just set it up there so there's not a lot of stress on it, and get it out of the way. We're going to take this bracket off, and then we'll move on. Okay, so the bracket's off. So what we got to do is the rotor's free. So we can just move it off of there. Now whenever you get a new rotor, you always get a can of brake cleaner and spray on it, because they put oils on here so it won't rust. And you don't want that. That just creates a bad seal to your brake pads. So get a can of brake cleaner and spray both sides really good. And that just slides off, like I say, and just slide the new one back on, and then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to stick this bracket back on. I'll point out here, they have these clips on here. Okay, and they do wear out. If you have driving down the road and you hit a bump and you hear rattles in the front, more than likely it's these clips that are worn out. Now, if you get a good set of brake pads, you get them free. I noticed that. I got these free included with the set. If you're curious, I just got them off of eBay. The rotors and the pads come as a set, but you can buy these separately at your auto parts store. So if they're worn out, it's better to replace them. And they are different sizes. So take note of which one goes where, because one of them's bigger than the other. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to stick this bracket back on. Now, another thing I generally do, I've had these bolts, that's a bolt that goes in to hold the bracket, back off on me more than once. So what I learned to do is I put a little bit of non-permanent Loctite on the bolts, tighten them down. I think there's just so much vibration and everything else there, they have a tendency to come loose. But at any rate, we're going to stick that bracket on next, and then we'll move on to the other parts. Okay, so with the bracket back on there, next thing we got to do is we got to compress these cylinders. So while we're here, I also like to point out, you see they have these rubber pieces, and inside there's a metal sleeve. Now, these calipers, this caliper is not that old. So these look really nice and new, but yours might look really old and the rubber rips up on them and things like that. Again, it's just like these pieces. You can buy them at auto parts store. You just go and you ask for the rubber pieces that go on the caliper. They got them in kits, usually, right on the shelf. Inexpensive. Next thing we got to do is push in the pistons. So you got two pistons. Now, this thing is the best invention somebody who ever thought of. Again, you find them in the auto parts store. They're cheap, and you can do it with one. I originally did it with one. Put an old brake shoe in there. Use the old one, don't use a new one because you'll crack it up. And then you tighten up on it. Now with one, you have to tighten up a little bit, and this goes in, then it'll start cocking. Then you have to come over here and do this one, then you move back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So I said, hey, why don't I just get two? So I got two of them, and I do it like that. So I just couple turns, couple turns, couple turns, couple turns, and you push these all the way in as far as they'll go. So that's what we're going to do next, and then we'll move on. Okay, so we got those all pushed in real good. Now, the next thing we do is we set our pads up in here. So you see I got my new pieces on here, and the pads just slip in on them. And wiggle it around a little bit, and they slip right on there. They just sit there. So you can see the rotor's still loose, and it'll all just sit there. So the only thing you have to watch, they're identical pads, except one of them has what they call a squealer. So if the brakes wear down quite a bit, that'll hit on the rotor and make noise before it tears the rotor up. So you only want that on one side, and then one of them on the other side of the wheel. So one on each side of the wheel, in other words, what I'm trying to say. So we just put this other pad in there. Okay, and then after you get that in there, then you slide the caliper back over top. Now, you might need two hands, one to hold the rotor up and one to slide it on, but it should slide right over top of it. Generally what I do is set one end in and then push the other end in. And it should just set there. If it's too tight, you may not have these in all the way. or it may be this rotor's cockpit, because nothing's holding this rotor right now. It's just sitting on the lugs. So put that back, your caliper back on, and put the 2 screws in it, and we'll move on to see what's next. So I'd like to add, we have tons of videos on Dodge trucks covering everything you can think of on these trucks. From transmission rebuilds, rear ends, you name it, we got it. Upgrades, all sorts of things. So be sure to subscribe and see if anything else can help you. This job right here, you take it somewhere, you're talking $1,000 plus to have it done at a shop. We get the whole thing done for under $200 in a couple hours. It gives you plenty of money to go out and eat somewhere and still have extra. So at any rate, I should have said before, I have done this before. It was irritating me the way it was loose here. So I stuck a lug on there just to hold the rotor tight and to get it all on there. And your caliper is floating. In other words, it moves. That's the whole design of it, squeeze like a, so it's got to move. And it sits on those 2 bolts. So you have to move it around a little bit to line up the bolts and get them to go in right. But a little bit of patience, you get it done. So that's pretty much the brake job. You put your spacer back on if you got dualies. And if not, you stick your wheel on and go do the other side and your brand new brakes. So thank you for watching. You have a pleasant day, and we'll see you in the next video.